Bom dia, hoje é 31 de julho de 2025. Meu nome é Breno Altman e estamos dando início a mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos. As dramáticas cenas do genocídio palestino expressam, nos tempos atuais, a grande ferida da humanidade. O Estado de Israel, há quase 2 anos, massacra diariamente a população na faixa de Gaza. Seu governo alega legítima defesa contra o Hamas e demais organizações da resistência palestina. Os números oficiais, entretanto, registram mais de 60 mil mortos, na sua maioria civis, especialmente mulheres e crianças. Desde março, quando Netanyahu rompeu unilateralmente o cessar-fogo, a faixa de Gaza está submetida a novos ataques e a um cerco famélico. A ajuda humanitária foi bloqueada pelos militares israelenses, levando centenas de milhares à fome e à doença. As escassas quantidades de alimentos que têm ingressado no enclave são distribuídas por uma fundação controlada por Israel e Estados Unidos, servindo de armadilha para atrair os palestinos e fuzilá-los em massa. Mais de 1.000 pessoas já foram assassinadas nas filas de alimentação. Esse cenário de horror provoca indignação em todas as partes do planeta, ainda que os governos continuem de braços cruzados com a Casa Branca e a União Europeia, mantendo seu apoio incondicional ao regime sionista. Vozes judaicas também se erguem contra essa carnificina. Talvez a mais conhecida dessas vozes seja a do cientista político Norman Finkelstein, nosso convidado de hoje. Fiquem conosco, já vamos começar. Good morning, Mr. Finkelstein. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to have you on the 20-minute show.
You're welcome.
Mr. Finkelstein, you have described what Israel is doing in Gaza as genocide. On what legal and historical grounds do you base this classification?
There are two ways of approaching the question. One is to look at the definition in the Genocide Convention of 1948, and that's what you might call a technical legal definition. And the second way to approach the question is to look at, say, what the Oxford English Dictionary has to say in defining the word genocide. So I don't have the Oxford Dictionary right now in front of me. Just give me, let's see, where did I, well, let's just go to Webster's Dictionary. And we're going to enter the word genocide. So they define genocide as the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. If you take that relatively straightforward definition of genocide, it's hard in my mind to see the deliberate, let's get it one more time, the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. It seems to me that if you look at that definition, it's hard not to conclude that what Israel is doing in Gaza constitutes a genocide. It's deliberate, it's systematic, and the goal is really, in my opinion, the goal has three discrete aspects to it. First of all, ethnic cleansing, to, in the most literal sense, clear out Gaza of all of its population. Secondly, to make Gaza unlivable, so that the population has no option at the end of the day. In this case, the day is now 21 months. They have no option except to leave. And the third goal is the systematic, methodical destruction of the people of Gaza so as to terrorize them into leaving. So genocide is a method, as is making Gaza unlivable. These are methods to achieve the aim of ethnically or making Gaza Arab-Rhine. The Nazis used to use the expression Judenrein, clean of Jews, and they want to make Gaza clean of Arabs. Now, it's also true to say that the longer it takes to achieve its goal of making Gaza Arab-Rhine, the more the means, namely genocide, becomes the ends, because you want to get them out. But if for some reason they're not leaving, you have to keep killing more and more and more. So at some point, the means, namely genocide, metamorphoses into an end in itself.
I understand. Would the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people be possible without the support of the United States and the European Union? What interests lie behind such complicity?
Well, the fact that they're enabling the genocide, again, in the most literal sense, because they're providing the weapons, not just the diplomatic cover, not just the it's not just the political enabling of Israel, there is the military enabling of Israel. To what end? I think at this point, it's just, in the case of the United States, it's just indifference. In the case of the Europeans, it's just cowardice. That Palestinians are not significant enough a political concern to compensate for getting into a conflict with the US. They don't consider the life and death of Palestinians a significant enough issue to warrant a break with the US. They consider tariffs a more important issue than Palestinians. Tariffs have more valence than the lives and deaths of Palestinians. There's no, look, the Europeans, the Americans, they're a horror show. They're the underside of the great march of civilization, or I should say Gaza is the underside of the great march of civilization. But I don't believe they actually want to kill all the Palestinians. They simply reach the political conclusion it's not worth the fight. I don't think it's much different than the Jews during World War II. It is true that the Allies, the only way to stop the final solution during World War II was to defeat Hitler. So the extent to which they invested in a military victory was would facilitate the end of the end of the final solution would facilitate bringing it to a close sooner. That's true. So I'm not going to fault the Allies because they focused on defeating Hitler. Hitler had to be defeated if the final solution would be stopped. But on the other hand, I very much doubt they cared very much what happened to the Jews in particular. Jews weren't liked. They were in all the European countries. They represented a problem, the Jewish problem it was called. So I don't believe they wanted to see the Jews killed during World War II, which is my parents' view. I don't agree with them on that. But I don't think they much cared either way. And I think it's the same thing with the Europeans now. They don't want to see Israel commit genocide, but they're not willing to invest any political capital in stopping it.
The state of Israel, Mr. Finkelstein, and its Western allies label Hamas and other Palestinian organizations as terrorist groups and classify the October 7th attack as an act of terrorism. Do you agree with that characterization?
I think October 7th was an act of terrorism. And I think, frankly, it was designed to be an act of terrorism. It was designed to shake the status quo, to force the world to confront the fact that the Palestinians in Gaza wouldn't acquiesce in their role to just languish and die in a concentration camp. So they wanted to, so to speak, shake the international chessboard in order to highlight the fact that the Palestinians, if left to languish and die in a concentration camp, would not quietly go to their deaths. So I think it was designed as an act of terrorism. It had a military component for sure, but it also, if you look at the numbers, about 400 military personnel, combatants were killed, and about 800, roughly 800 civilians were killed. So I would say, roughly speaking, that indicates the preponderance of the events of October 7th were intended to be terroristic. And as I said, look, in most political struggles, there has been, not in all, but in most, there has been a terroristic component. Terror meaning the dictionary definition, the targeting of civilians to achieve a political end. So most emancipatory struggles had a terrorist, and most military, of course, most military engagements have a terroristic component. On the other hand, as I've said many times, given that the people in Gaza had no options by October 7th, they had exhausted all the options of a diplomatic settlement, reliance on the mechanisms of international law, nonviolent civil resistance. They had exhausted all those options. I personally am not prepared to condemn those who carried out the events of October 7th. I'm not prepared to condemn them, but I am, as a factual matter, as you might say, a dictionary definition matter, yes, the acts were acts of terrorism.
In several interviews, you have compared the Zionist regime to Nazism, a comparison strongly rejected by Zionists. Do you truly believe there are similarities between the two?
Well, obviously, there are similarities. There are similarities generally between any two events, as different as they might be. You can find similarities. The question is, how significant are the similarities, and are they significant enough between two discrete events, whether they're significant enough that making the analogy is intellectually or morally illuminating. I would say on many levels, obviously, there are differences between the Nazi final solution and what Israel is doing. Uh, One obvious difference is the magnitude. As you know, at some point, quantity turns into quality. So even if we take the uppermost figure, I noticed the other day Ralph Nader is claiming the um, political figure in the US, Ralph Nader. He's claiming 500,000 Palestinians have been killed so far. For all I know, it's true. I don't think anyone has any real handle on how many Palestinians have been killed. And then you have all the secondary questions: how many have been killed by direct targeting, how many have been killed because of malnutrition, how many have been killed because of illnesses that were preventable, except for the fact that all the doctors and hospitals were destroyed. So those calculations will take time to figure out. But let's say we take the figure, let's take Ralph Nader's figure of 500,000, which is 10 times the official figure of the Gaza health ministry. 500,000 is not yet 5 million. The numbers for the Jews killed is between 5 and 6 million. So let's say 6 million. It's not yet 6 million. There's a difference of magnitude, which I would say it's not trivial. So there are obvious differences, but there are also differences which work to Israel's moral detriment. This is a real life genocide unfolding before our eyes. The Nazis were aware they could not do what Israel is doing. They had to wait for a war situation, and in the fog of war, to conceal the final solution. It's not as if they broadcast it on the equivalent back then of social media, what they were doing. Israel, it's being broadcast in real time. Now, of course, they make all these sorts of excuses to pretend as if what's happening is not happening. But everyone with a barely lucid mind can see they're carrying out in broad daylight, not behind the walls of a concentration camp, not with the war as a concealment device. They're carrying out in broad daylight a genocide. And the population is on the board with the genocide. As the opposition leader said a few months ago, the Israeli opposition leader, he said these soldiers are killing children as a hobby. That's his words, not mine. The public opinion polls show that half Israeli Jews are on board they were asked the question, if the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, if it enters a city, should it kill everyone in the city, down to the last person? Half the Israeli Jews said yes. A question was put to the Israelis, are there any innocents in Gaza, or is everybody a target, a legitimate target? About 70% of Israeli Jews said there are no innocents in Gaza. Now, let's make the comparison with Nazi Germany. Number one, it's hard to say whether the results among Germans would have been as bad as that. But even if they were, there's a very big difference, or there is technically a very big difference. Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state. During the war, the German people were being bombarded day in and day out, bombarded with the allegation that the war was caused by a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. The Jews and the Bolsheviks, the Judeo-Bolsheviks, were trying to destroy Germany. And that's what the Germans heard over and over again in a totalitarian state with no dissent. So when the German soldiers are dropping like flies in the Russian winter, and they're starving to death and freezing to death, in the minds of most Germans, it's the Jews and the Bolsheviks, the Judeo-Bolsheviks, that are doing this. So it's quite possible. There's all sorts of scholarship on the subject. I don't think anything definitive has been found, for the simple reason that if it's a totalitarian state, it's difficult to find results of what Germans were thinking or why they were thinking what they were thinking. But in the case of Israel, it's not a totalitarian state. They have the highest usage of the internet per capita of any country in the world. Their soldiers are posting on the websites what they're doing. Everybody knows exactly what's going on. They're not victims of a totalitarian state. They are, to use an old expression, they are willing executioners of the Israeli genocide. So that particular comparison in the attempted analogy, that particular comparison works against Israel. It makes it worse than what happened under the Nazis at that level of the comparison.
Israel has become a racist colonial outpost. Was Zionism inherently racist and supremacist from the outset, or did it evolve in that direction over time?
Every nationalist ideology has a latent supremacist component. The nationalism, it frequently talks about being I'm not talking just about Jewish nationalism. It has a component that speaks to the superiority of that particular group of people, the fact that they were chosen in some respect. It's very hard to find, especially in the Eastern European nationalisms, a Polish nationalism or Central European, a German nationalism. They all had what you might call a chauvinistic component to it. And there's no question that there was, because in order to achieve its goal, they needed a justifying a justifying ideology to ethnically cleanse the land, that there was a brutal rationalizing component to Zionism, as there was to American nationalism. The extermination of the native population in the US was a very ugly business, and it embraced virtually all, even decent thinkers, politicians, public figures of the era when the ethnic cleansing of the West was going on. So there's no question that just as the Americans have a very ugly history when it comes to Native Americans, I mean, it's kind of shocking even to a person who has read a lot of history, even to the history is very ugly. So there's that element in Israel. Israel's about 80 years old. That would make the United States from 1776, roughly 1850. 1850, the extermination of the native population was still going on. 1850 was before the American Civil War, so slavery was still intact in the US. So from that point of view, Israel after 80 years is about as ugly as the US after 80 years. I would say, I don't want to make any more comparisons. I just think it's very hard to compare the situations, except to say, in my opinion, there are significant similarities between the US in its, let's say, after 80 years, by 1850, and Israel today. And there are significant similarities and also differences which work to Israel's detriment in the case of Nazi Germany versus Israel.
But Netanyahu is out of the blue a deviation from the original Zionist ideas, or is it a natural consequence of the Zionism as thought by Theodor Herzl and other people?
First of all, I don't think it has much to do with Netanyahu. This obsession and fixation on Netanyahu is designed to distract attention from the fact that there is a broad consensus across the political spectrum and a broad consensus across Israeli Jewish society supporting Netanyahu's principal objectives. The principal objective of Mr. Netanyahu is to once and for all solve the Gaza question, and also, if possible, the West Bank question and the regional questions. They've solved to their satisfaction the Hezbollah question, they've solved the Lebanon question, and now they still want to solve the Iran question. On those issues, there's no difference at all between Netanyahu and the rest of the Israeli political spectrum or the rest of Israeli society. Mr. Netanyahu is an obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist. In other words, he is the perfect mirror of Israeli society. The Israelis are obnoxious, self-righteous, Jewish supremacists. By and large, there are exceptions, honorable exceptions for sure. But the truth of the matter is there were many more, percentage-wise, there were many more honorable German exceptions to the Nazis than there are Jewish exceptions to this nation of obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacists, and now we have to add genocidal murderers. Very few exceptions. Once in a while, the liberal newspaper Haaretz tries to show there's 4, 5, maybe 6 dissenters. Well, folks, if the best you can come up with is 6, let me advise you not to even bring up the subject. Now, on secondary issues, whether to prioritize bringing home the hostages or prioritize liquidating the Gaza question, yes, there are significant differences. I have no doubt about it. But it's just a distraction in order to avoid looking at how ugly that place has become. It's a distraction to focus on Mr. Netanyahu as if his main objectives are not shared by the breadth of the political spectrum and the breadth of the Israeli Jewish society. They're all on the same page. They've become a monster state, unfortunately. At the end of the day, the U.S. lost an astonishing 700,000 persons, 700,000 to bring an end to slavery. Now, you could say motives were mixed. Some people fought in order to preserve the Union, and a large number didn't want to fight. There were what were called the draft riots. But at the end of the day, it was a monumental sacrifice. 700,000 Americans died in the course of the Civil War. A large number of them dying in order to effectively end slavery. I couldn't imagine 6 Israelis who would die to end who would willingly give up their lives to end the extermination of the Palestinians. I'm serious. I mean, even Haaretz, their newspaper, says it had an editorial last week. It was very frank. It said nobody cares. Nobody cares in Israel that all these people are being murdered, starved to death. Nobody cares. I wouldn't say that's accurate. I think a large number of them relish it. They're gleeful. They're very happy. That's not my speculation. They post videos showing how gleeful they are.
He once supported the two-state solution, but now, as I could read some weeks ago, you did not consider it no longer viable.
No,
When do you?
I never said any such thing. I think too much, there's so much death and so much destruction. And I can understand that people feel completely powerless, impotent at this point. You wonder what can be done. Yesterday, for the first time in a long time, I skipped the demonstration because it just didn't feel like it would do anything. But the answer is not to squander time on graduate school seminars on one or two states. It has no relevance now. One or two states where? Is there anybody who believes that Israel at this point is going to remove the settlers from the West Bank? A large percentage of whom would have to leave in order to make possible a viable Palestinian state? Does anybody believe that? Is there a Palestinian leadership that represents Palestinians at this point? There's not the most basic constituents of one state, two states, 10 states, or no states. It's a completely irrelevant question. It's totally beside the point. People are bored, so they bring up this question again of one state, two states. There's a genocide going on.
But what's the solution?
There is none right now. Sometimes there aren't solutions. Right now, everybody should be giving their all to trying to end the genocide. Now, what form that will take, I can't tell you. I could say, obviously, that the methods used thus far have not succeeded. What will it take? I don't know. I wish people would think of more militant action, and I would certainly be among those. And I think there would be many who would be willing to take more aggressive steps than simply demonstrating in the streets. I believe people are ready, but there hasn't been a leadership that's proposed something more militant.
Your parents were Holocaust survivors, and you have said they despised the state of Israel. How did their experience shape your political thinking?
The fact that they despised Israel is simply a fact. For very idiosyncratic reasons. They were fanatically pro-Soviet, pro-Soviet, pro-Russian. The two were the same back then. And they considered Israel's alignment with the West against the Soviet Union a betrayal, because it was obviously, for anybody who's politically literate, it was the Soviet Union that defeated the Nazis. 90% of the Nazi forces up until 1944 were on their Eastern Front. The Americans lost about 400,000 people in World War II. The British about 400,000. The Russians 30 million. 3 times as many Russians died in the siege of Leningrad as the total number of Americans killed. the total number of British and Russians killed, British and Americans killed, was still only 2/3 of the number of Russians who were killed in the siege of Leningrad during World War II. It's just stupid to compare the sufferings of the Russian people and the sacrifices of the Russians with those of any other country. The other exception, of course, is China, which lost about 25 million people to the Japanese, who were monsters during World War II, monsters. So my parents, since they were among the survivors, felt a deep debt to the Soviet Union.
Where were they from?
Both of my parents were from Warsaw, Poland. After the uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was repressed in April 1943. They were deported. All the survivors, estimates about 20,000, were deported, 20 to 40,000, were deported to Majdanek concentration camp. My father ended up in Auschwitz and was on the Auschwitz death march. My mother ended up in a slave labor camp. My mother was liberated by the Russians, my father by the Americans. I don't hear you.
For their whole life, they were critical of Israel.
Yes, because they thought they were traitors. And my parents valued faithfulness and loyalty. They would, in the darkest days of the Cold War, they would never utter a single word critical of Russia or critical of Stalin. Never. Not so much.
Even when Stalin was accused of anti-Semitism?
They denied it. I'm not saying they were right. I'm simply saying factually, they would not bite the hand that fed them.
Mm-hmm. And they have influence on your way of thinking about the Zionist question?
I do believe in faithfulness. I don't. If you break faith, you have to have a very good reason. I mean, you have to have a very good reason. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you love your mother, you love your father, and then you discover they committed some horrible crime, and you have to choose between the love of your parent and the crime. There was a very good film by the, I guess it's a Greek filmmaker, Costa Gavras. It was called The Music Box. Very worth watching, I think, because that dilemma arises in the case of that film. It's one of the better films in the Nazi Holocaust. It's not a spectacular, it's not Steven Spielberg, but on a micro level, it poses the question correctly, in my opinion. So yeah, faithfulness is important to me. It was very important to Professor Chomsky, by the way, maybe to a fault. Professor Chomsky would never, ever betray a friend. Never. I benefited from that because there are times when I came under very heavy criticism, not just from the right or the center, but also from the left. And he had reservations about things I said, as this is normal, and things I did, which is normal, but he would never publicly voice them. He had a very deep sense of faithfulness, from which, as I said, I benefited. So that value I took from my parents. Your integrity cannot be purchased. My parents liked money. And there was a time when, because they were authentic survivors, most of the people who claimed to be survivors, just complete mythology, just made up. I knew the survivor community. It was so tiny. It was so tiny. Most of the people who claimed to be were survivors. They survived in the Soviet Union. They went to the East. They didn't survive the Holocaust. They escaped the Holocaust by going to the Soviet Union. But when the Holocaust became an industry and everybody wanted to pretend to be a survivor, the escapees became survivors. They escaped the Holocaust. Very small handful survived the death camps, the slave labor camps, the ghettos. So, because my parents were authentic survivors, they were in a lot of demand during the heyday, the height of the Holocaust industry. A real survivor, the real McCoy, as my mother said. But that usually came with a price. The price was you had to denounce the Soviet Union. At the same, because of the whole issue back then of what was called Soviet Jewry and the oppression of the Soviet Jews. So those two issues were conflated. Remembering the Holocaust also at that time necessarily meant denouncing the Soviet Union and denouncing its treatment of Jews. So if you were invited to an event, you had to do two things. You had to give testimony to your experience during World War II, and you had to denounce the Soviet Union. My parents would never do the second. So they were never invited. Never, 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 never. They were never invited because the issue of the Soviet Union always came up, and my parents were not politically correct on that question. Now, you could offer them, believe me, I know my parents, you can offer them $100,000, which at that time was a lot of money. You can offer them $100,000, just announce the Soviet Union, it'll never happen. Never, 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 never. They would never do it. And that part I got. I inherited from them. I appropriated from them.
Mr. Finkelstein, you have written a very important book, The Industry of Holocaust. Did Zionists illegitimately appropriate the Holocaust?
They turned it into they weaponized it. They weaponized the Nazi Holocaust basically to claim that no people in the world had ever suffered the way Jews suffered during World War II, and therefore you can't apply the same moral, legal, and political standards to Jews because their suffering was unique. And given that it was unique, you can't apply general principles to them, that they're exempt. Unique suffering conferred on Jews unique exemptions from normal, conventional, legal, and moral standards. So they weaponized the Nazi Holocaust. I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Okay. You have been ostracized by parts of the academic establishment and the Jewish community in the United States. Some even call you a traitor, including fellow Jews. How do you cope with this isolation, and how do you respond to the frequent accusation of self-hatred directed at Jewish critics of Israel?
At some point in my life, it did cause me a certain amount of discomfort, but I'm way past that. I have been involved in this question for 40 years, and at some point you develop a thick skin. The word in English is inured, I-N-U-R-E-D. You get hardened to it, so I don't think about that at all anymore. It's of no interest or concern to me. As to the self-hating Jew, for all I know, the human psyche is very complex. I think everybody understands that after a certain age. Trying to understand the injunction that you should, know thyself. Knowing thyself is very, very tough. Forget about knowing others. Just knowing yourself. The human psyche is just a very complex faculty or organ. So for all I know, all the allegations leveled against me, for all I know, they're true. I don't engage in this kind of indignant denial. My response is, let's say everything you say about me is true. Does that change the facts? If Einstein were a self-hating Jew, does that mean E does not equal MC squared? And if he were a self-loving Jew and believed that E equals MC cubed, would that become true because he's a self-loving Jew? The facts are the facts. They don't change depending on whether you love yourself or hate yourself. And so my belief is, for argument's sake, everything you say about me, I'll concede for argument's sake it's all true. But how does that change the facts?
How the Zionist lobby act in the United States is still as strong as it used to be before October 7th, or it's losing power, is losing its strength in the last months?
The lobby has two aspects to it. There's the money aspect, and there's the voting bloc aspect. Jews constitute an important voting bloc in critical states in the United States. So I would say in terms of the voting bloc, there has been a significant loss of support from Jews for the state of Israel. So that is going to manifest itself in the strength or the weakening of the Israel lobby. In terms of money, I think it's probably as strong. There's a Jewish supremacist billionaire class which has just a huge amount of money because of the fantastic inequality in the distribution of wealth in our country. So they could still provide AIPAC with the Israel lobby with a large amount of money. And they have a huge amount of power. I mean, sometimes it's just amazing to behold the kinds of power. They were instrumental, the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. They were instrumental in ousting 3 Ivy League presidents. The president of Harvard University, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, the president of Columbia University. They were ousted by this Jewish billionaire supremacist class, which threatened, if you don't crush the anti-genocide demonstrations, we're going to withhold our alumni contributions.
But is Zionism losing support inside Jewish community in the United States?
Yes, I said there are two components. There is the voting bloc component, the support among Jews, yes, and there has been definitely among younger Jews a distancing from Israel, but there's also the money component. And the Jewish billionaire, the Jewish supremacist billionaire class, they're as powerful as ever. They're more powerful because of the maldistribution of wealth. It just doesn't, when you look at the alumni who threatened Harvard, the Jewish alumni, one had already given Harvard $200 million. One had given Harvard $300 million. Many had given Harvard tens of millions of dollars. That's a lot of money. And Harvard was not about to kiss it goodbye. It crushed, as did the other schools, all the other schools. They crushed the encampments because of the money.
How do you assess the crackdown on pro-Palestinian solidarity movements in the United States and Europe, particularly on university campuses?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What's about the repression on pro-Palestinian solidarity movements in the USA and Europe universities?
It succeeded. I can't speak for Europe. I haven't followed it closely enough. The repression succeeded. Force often works. People like to believe that force can't work or can only work temporarily, or that truth will ultimately triumph and justice will ultimately triumph. There's some truth to that, I suppose. But in the meantime, force can work. The colleges this past academic year were completely silent. Everybody was terrified of the repression. The Jewish billionaire class, they killed academic freedom in our country. They killed it. It was murder in broad daylight. Academic freedom ended in our country. It continues to die its death. Each day they give in to more and more of President Trump's demands, and the demands by Trump are being made by the Jewish billionaire class. Trump has to repay them. So every day there's another story about the demands being made and the concessions being made by the universities. Academic freedom is over here. At least for now, it's over. It'll take probably quite a while to recuperate.
My last question, Mr. Finkelstein. Are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future of the Palestinian people?
There's no grounds whatsoever for optimism. None at all. Anybody who's optimistic now is in desperate need of mental therapy. The news each day. I don't think it can get worse. I mean, right now, it's the final phase of the final solution. They're trying to batter and batter and batter and batter the Palestinians until, on their own volition, they rush to the gates of Gaza to let us through. That's what they want. They're communicating the message: you are not getting food. You will either starve to death, or if you go to these distribution centers, they're gas chambers. That's what they are. They're death camps. They're just as sick to call these distribution centers Gaza Humanitarian Fund as to have the sign in Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. It's just as sick. Humanitarian, GHF, God, it's sick. The Israelis talk about building, quote, a humanitarian city in Rafah. Yeah, just like showers in Auschwitz. Just like showers in Auschwitz.
And what to do? There is nothing to do?
I said, if a leadership can consolidate around more militant action, I think people are prepared to go further. But right now, a leadership and a plan has not yet emerged. There are always things to do. The question is leadership and organization. I think people are ready to do more, to give of themselves one last time. But optimism, that's just lunatic, to be optimistic right now. Okay.
Do you believe in boycott, divestment, and sanctions?
Oh, people just come up with, they think by, abracadabra, presto, that's like BDS. You think a slogan is going to solve a problem. No political analysis, no social analysis, no nothing. Just shout the slogan. Just shout BDS. Show how radical you are. What has BDS achieved? It's been around since 2005. What has it achieved? I'm not opposing it, but the idea that a slogan can be a substitute for substantive analysis of a situation, it's so idiotic. It's like open sesame, abracadabra. No attempt to analyze the situation and try to figure out what to do now. How do we proceed? If everything in politics could be resolved with a slogan, you wouldn't have to read any books. You wouldn't have to do any analysis. All you have to do is shout a slogan.
My real last question, is Israel forever?
Listen, I know one thing for sure. I'm not forever. In fact, I'm not for many more years. So I'm not going to squander. If the laws of physics are correct, nothing is forever. When you read Bertrand Russell on atheism, and he talks very calmly about the fact, of course, the sun is will expire. The sun will expire. The universe will disappear, and he's very calm about it. And, of course, I'm filled with holy terror at those prospects. What is the point in contemplating whether Israel is forever? The likelihood is nothing is forever. So I don't contemplate those questions. They're just meaningless to me.
Mrs. Finkelstein, thank you very much once again for your time and for this vital conversation. We are truly grateful for your presence on our program.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Também agradeço a todas e todos que assistiram a esse programa, em especial aquelas e aqueles que puderam fazer contribuições financeiras ao nosso site e ao canal de Opera Mundi no YouTube. Sem vocês, nosso trabalho não seria possível e não faria sentido. Um grande abraço a todas e a todos.